on his way from a vote, so we decided that we'd start, and Angus will join us when he can. Good to see a lot of familiar faces in the room. My name's Josh Buckland. I'm a senior fellow at Policy Exchange, and before that spent a long time in the UK government working on energy and environment policy. We're here today to talk about the launch of Policy Exchange's latest paper from the Energy and Environment Unit, turning waste energy into hydrogen. And we'll hopefully have a really interesting conversation today on both the substance of that report, but also really importantly, the broader questions it raises about the transition of the UK's energy system and what it obviously means for the UK's place in the world. I'm going to talk for as little as possible. We want to hear from our esteemed panel, who I'll introduce in a moment. And then we want to get to your questions, both from those who are in the room today, and great to see a real good turnout, as well as those who are online, who were zooming in, I'm promised, and hopefully we'll then be able to answer some questions on the online forum. So we'll get plenty of time for that, and I've stressed to our panellists that they're only allowed to talk for 5 minutes up front, and I will be timing you to make sure that is the case. We've got just a couple of house rules. We've got an hour. We will finish a little bit further beyond 2, so do, if you need to leave, do, but we just want to make sure we use the time effectively, given we're starting a bit late. As I said, there will be time for questions, but please do make them short and focused. Introduce yourself when you come in, and make sure there is a question rather than a statement. Otherwise, again, I'll pull you up on that. And critically, try and ensure that we structure the conversation around broadly the themes of the discussion today, to ensure that we're actually getting the most out of our panellists and asking them some difficult and interesting questions. Now that dull stuff's over, let me just briefly introduce our panel. I won't introduce Angus because he's not here, which would be a bit odd. But let me start with yourself, Emma. Emma is the CEO of Energy UK. She'll be known to many of you from your TV screens, radios, at all hours of the day. I'm not quite sure how you do it. But Emma has been the CEO for the last 4 years, where I'm sure you can all agree the energy sector has been pretty quiet, and so Emma's had a pretty easy time of it. But great to have Emma here with us today. And critically, I've known Emma for a long time. She's a real advocate of the UK as a leader in the energy transition, and critically the economic and environmental benefits that will flow from that for the UK and UK citizens. So it'd be good to hear from you today about how this fits into that broader transition. And then after Emma, I've also got Antony Green, who is newly the Future Energy Director at SGN for the last couple of months or a year or so.
5 months.
5 months, exactly.
5 months,
and many will know Tony from his previous jobs. He spent 30-odd years in the energy industry, very recently at National Gas, well, now we call it National Gas. We don't call it National Gas Energy Transmission or whatever we used to call it. But Tony is a really valued part of the energy family. He's an engineer by background and brings a real capability in terms of the substance of what needs to change with the energy system over the course of the coming decades. So it'd be really good to hear from Tony about everything that's going on in the company, but also critically how he views this issue today. And also thanks to Tony from SGN for making this research possible and for supporting the development of Policy Exchange's work. So thanks to Tony and the team. Before we do get to some opening remarks just from those on the panel, I just wanted to turn to the report that's just been published, which is the subject of our session today. The core thesis of the paper is pretty simple, actually, even for those who are not energy experts. The UK, and you can debate where the leadership in terms of global leadership is going, how the UK is competing against other countries more recently. But one area where the UK has had real success over the last decade has unarguably been the deployment of wind power, particularly offshore wind. We've got a significant amount of installed capacity, and that is developing further over the course of the coming years. But critically, there is a danger that we become victim of our own success. We've got a lot of electricity being generated from wind, but there's a real challenge at the moment getting that electricity from where it's generated to where it needs to be utilised. And critically, especially in the case of offshore wind, that distance and the challenge of transferring that energy over a long period of time and long distance is becoming a real difficult challenge. So critically, the question now for consumers and obviously for politicians is how to ensure the system of large-scale electricity production, largely happening away from centres of demand, actually benefits consumers, and that flow of cheap green power actually gets to people's homes. And at the moment, that is not happening. We're seeing consumers already charged over £1 billion a year as we think about curtailment costs, so effectively the wind being turned off and consumers still paying for that wind power because of the fact we can't get it to where it's needed. And that number could increase, and some of the numbers that have analysis that's been done show that that could increase to £3.5 billion at least within the next decade. So this is becoming a really significant cost for consumers, but also critically, as we think about the broader energy transition, it is starting to rob households and businesses of the cheap green power that they can do things with. So in the case of businesses, economic growth, employment, new businesses, the fact that we're not getting that green power to where it's needed is ultimately holding back the UK's economic performance as much as anything else. And that problem will only get further more difficult as we develop further. What does all that mean? Well, critically, there is then an opportunity. And there is an opportunity to turn some of that wasted wind and the excess curtailment that's currently underway and turn it into other energy vectors. And the subject of this report and the really valuable work and modelling that LCP Delta have done for us shows that actually there's a real opportunity to transfer that wind into hydrogen power. And that could displace 2/3 of the UK's current carbon-intensive grey hydrogen, and critically could deliver 2/3 of the government's current stated target for green hydrogen production by 2030. So we're talking big numbers here, and we're talking about a really significant opportunity for the UK to show leadership and start building a hydrogen as well as an electricity system that is fit for the future. How do we do it? Well, there's a set of 7 recommendations within the report itself. They're quite technical and detailed, but hopefully resonate with those in the room today, and very happy for us to get into a conversation on the detail. But they broadly fit into 3 camps. Firstly, wind farms must be provided with a combination of positive and negative incentives to join up with green hydrogen producers. So there's a question there about location. Secondly, those green hydrogen producers must also be incentivised to actually bring their investment to the UK through decent and credible business models, something the government is doing a lot on already. And then thirdly, and this is actually an issue that has been in the news and debated a lot politically recently, the hydrogen produced must have a market to go to, and there must be a clear market for off-takers, likely heavy industry in the near term, but obviously other sectors potentially in the future. So the recommendations in the report effectively try to bring those 3 issues to life and offer government and regulators a very clear set of options they can develop to seize this opportunity, and critically, stop charging consumers too much for the electricity they're using, and critically help grow the economy as a result of access to cheap hydrogen, which could be a game changer for the UK. That's the report in a nutshell. Hopefully everyone's already had a chance to read the entire thing, so I didn't need to go into any more detail. With that, let's get to our discussion. As I said, I want to bring in our panellists for a couple of minutes just to give their view either on how the broader hydrogen question fits into the energy transition, or alternatively some of the specifics of the report. I'll turn in the first instance to you, Emma, if that's okay.
Thank you, Josh. And the answer to how do I get up early in the morning to do the immediate question is that in my time as Chief Exec, I also very wisely decided to have 2 small children. So that's why, and they are always my excuse for whatever goes wrong here. I thought I'd start by talking and highlighting really what Energy UK does and the importance of that to this debate, in that we look after the entire system. So we're technology agnostic. We have everything from thermal generators to renewables generators and developers to battery storage providers, and then crucially, and heating installers, to the other end of the system where we've also got the people that have to bill people. And so Josh is right, it has been a busy time because we are responsible for and fully support the energy transition, but also have to work out how to do that fairly and where we take the costs for it from society and for the economy. And whenever you talk about costs of renewables, there's a big red alarm bell that goes off in my head, particularly at this time in the UK, that leads me to want to clarify that even with the additional costs of renewables on the system, the overall case for the energy transition in the UK is a very positive one for the UK economy, and we are pretty sure it will lead to lower bills in the long run. A lot of the challenges we're talking about are the hump of the transition for the next 10 to 15 years as we're putting on our novel technologies onto essentially an existing grid and into markets that existed before we really understood these technologies and how they work. And a lot of the challenge here is about resolving the inequalities of that for the next 10 to 15 years while being absolutely clear about where we need to go in the best interests of consumers. There's a crunchy thing that we need to do, and it was implicit in what Josh said, but some of these costs are literally because we are building generation capacity without having the grid infrastructure to support it, so we can't move the electrons around efficiently. So there's a huge programme of work that's been announced by the Prime Minister, by the Secretary of State, the Leader of the Opposition on grid, and that makes me very happy as an energy nerd because it's the first time in 15 years I've heard any attention being given to the grid, and oh boy do we need it. So we do actually also need to build cables, wires, connections and speed that process up. Secondly, I'd say the priority is we also need to use the system more dynamically. So we are broadly pro this thing called electrification that you hear bandied around, which is the idea that we're going to have a lot more electric technologies on the system in your houses, in communities and buildings like this. So there'll be more electrified heating, you'll probably be driving EVs in the future. That is actually more efficient. So being able to use the electricity efficiently through the system in the first instance is also a priority, and making these technologies work together we think can also save over £1 billion a year in how we manage the system and the costs of it. The third thing, though, is that, as Josh said, we do actually need to do other things. Electricity will not decarbonise the whole economy. We know that we need green hydrogen. That's in the Committee on Climate Change pathways. It's in all sensible energy analyst pathways, that you're going to need something else. And then the question is, how do you produce that in a way that is economically efficient and cost effective? And also, just from an industrial point of view, how do you nick as much of that emerging market as possible and keep it in the UK? And a clever way of solving many of those problems is to think about, at times when we are currently overproducing wind generation, when we can't use it efficiently in the system, when we don't want to, build grid infrastructure we don't need, how can we use that additional power to make green hydrogen and use it as storage locally to balance the system, use it for heavy industry, for aviation, for shipping, or for some of the other needs in this report. And we fully support that as the sort of vision for the future. Just in terms of what that means in terms of energy market design, some of it is quite interesting. At the moment, when you guys think of energy, you probably think of like power plants, pylons, which I'm told I have to refer to as towers for any engineers in the room that want to shout at me about that, cables, and the kind of traditional energy system. If you're thinking about a hydrogen economy, we also need to understand manufacturing. You need to understand where the gas networks are, and we need to think about energy policy far more broadly across the economy, and projects as being maybe a power plant, maybe an industrial cluster, maybe a pipeline. How do you design the markets, the incentives, the systems for that kind of industrial footprint? That leads you to this following thing, which is we need a much more strategic view of what we will use gas for, what we won't use it for, and where it will be. So where is the hydrogen economy going to be? Where are our hydrogen abated or other power plant in relation to that industrial cluster? Where are the pipelines and connections? How do we move it? So you need that whole value chain pretty clearly mapped out, and that is a bit of a strategic job for government that currently is missing, as well as the hydrogen and CCS work that Josh referred to. And then the other things here are about the more traditional stuff we think about and the non-hydrogen things we can do to fix the constraint costs, and those are get demand and flexibility right. We need to be able to use storage properly. We need to be able to electrify properly. We need consumers to benefit from technologies. That's different markets, different costs, different services, but it's also building the infrastructure that we do need to build, so speeding up grids, speeding up planning, taking the fight to people that don't want to build some pylons so that we can benefit from cheap power, making those decisions. And lastly, and I suppose the generic thing I always say is the thing that came out of here for me is some of these costs increase by 2030. As I said, I've been doing this well over, embarrassingly, 10 years now. This is the first time I've heard grid being talked about seriously or people acknowledging these concerns. This needs to be tackled in the very early years of the next government, if not before. And the pace and urgency thing is really important, particularly off the back of an energy crisis where I've still got millions of households really struggling with their energy bills this year. So I think these abstract discussions are really important, but I also want to see some pace and action.
Definitely, thanks, Emma. That's really useful, and you've covered a lot of issues there.
Yeah,
I think your final point on kind of how we then translate that into kind of material action is hopefully what this report starts to get into, the actual specific regulatory policy changes that will actually start joining up the systems in a more coherent way. So it'd be good to touch on those in a bit more detail later. Tony, could I ask you to give us some similar opening thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I guess I really want to start thinking about the bigger picture here that the report starts to provide, and that's about thinking about energy in that whole systems lens, like a wider ecosystem rather than a set of discrete technologies that are sitting out there. We know curtailing green electrons just doesn't make sense, doesn't make sense at all. So it's not the right thing to do for net zero. So if we can't use the green electricity directly, then we really should be utilising it. We should be storing it, we should be moving it to somewhere in the net zero landscape that will actually deliver benefit. So I think it's really fascinating then when we start to look at Scotland in particular. I think we've got a very unique opportunity here, and this is highlighted in the report. We've got the right ingredients. We've got excess electricity at the current time that is constrained. Every time I go to Scotland, it's always raining. It's plentiful of water. We need that for electrolysis. And getting very parochial, we've got a pipeline network that can actually help us move that energy once we convert it across. And we've got to get that to our key industries. And I think it's really rare that we actually have an opportunity to make an intervention that solves not one problem, but two, in the sense of we deconstrain the electricity network and it helps kickstart a nascent hydrogen market. And the scale at which we're talking here is quite significant. It would give that jump start that's needed to that hydrogen market. So we should think about the decarbonisation opportunities. Josh, in your introduction there, you started to talk about where we should actually use it, displacing the feedstocks. Grey hydrogen produces an awful lot of CO2 right now. We've got to work on displacing that because that's a feedstock that we use for a lot of our industrial processes in the country. If you look back to the hydrogen strategy, government said we're going to need somewhere between 250 and 460 terawatt hours of hydrogen. That's enormous. Yeah. So even if we're deconstraining, we've still got to build on that. So that hydrogen's got to come from multiple sources. So that's where you start to see why we've got to build this with scale. And start focusing on some of the key industrial and commercial applications. Steel, 2.4% of our CO2 emissions. Cement, 1.4%. And that's before we start thinking about other applications further down. But the other thing we've got to think about with hydrogen is we can actually store it. So as we think about energy resilience and energy security going forward, we've got an ability here to produce energy, store it when we don't need it, and then we can bring it back. You mentioned CCGTs, we can run those on hydrogen in the future, or even just peakers when we need to. So there's a real benefit there. So I think looking across the renewable landscape, by optimizing the technology across both electricity and gas, we can start to get a win-win. We know any upgrades to our networks are expensive, so if we can maximize the flex between the two and find that sweet spot in the middle, we're going to be in a much, much better position. We do have to invest in networks full stop though. Yep. So whatever national grid are planning with the bootstraps to provide that, we're still going to have to deconstrain. I think there's still going to be need. We're going to need that hydrogen backbone. And I think in the report, if you look at the peak, it says we'll deconstrain 18 terawatt hours with 14 gigawatts of electrolysis capacity. That is a huge piece of infrastructure, ladies and gentlemen, for getting to 14 gigawatts of electrolysis. So, this isn't a case of we don't do it in one sector and we have to build it in another. We are looking here across, actually investing quite extensively as we get to net zero across the sectors. So that's got to be good for the economy. You mentioned it's really good from the point of view of driving green jobs, particularly if I come back to the Scottish footprint. It's about transitioning oil and gas workers out of those fossil fuel industries into a green industry going forward. And from a Scottish point of view, there's a real view there that they can become a net exporter of energy. I can see it, just looking across the piece there, it's going to happen. Export south of the border to the rest of the UK, but also those linkages out into Europe, and that gives us more energy resilience. You'll see in the report it refers to Project Union, the hydrogen backbone. If you run that down to the interconnectors at Buckland, we then have got the hydrogen backbone which into Europe, which is a 53,000 kilometre network. So you start opening up a much wider market overall. So overall, that's got to be good for us all in the sense of it drives a reduction in CO2 emissions, it drives efficiency across our energy sectors, and it helps us all personally in the pocket.
Brilliant, thanks, Tony. I just on your point around there needs to be 14 gigawatts to kind of enable the outcomes of the report. I don't think I'm wrong in saying the government's recent hydrogen competition has signed off. Is it 200 megawatts roundabout, something around that? So that just shows the scale of the challenge in terms of how much more needs to be developed. So
absolutely,
appreciate those initial thoughts. Perfect timing. Angus MacNeil MP has joined us, and thanks so much for doing so. I know it's a busy day in Parliament for all sorts of reasons, and like quite a late evening by the sounds of it. For those who don't know Angus, and many of you will, because Angus had a long-term interest in energy issues. Angus has been an MP since 2005 and is currently chair of the Energy Security and Net Zero Committee, so has a very important role in Parliament, scrutinising everything government is doing when it comes to the agenda and the issues we're discussing today. You won't remember, Angus, but actually I was sat behind the PM, David Cameron, when he was PM, in 2015 at the Liaison Committee, where you were asking very difficult questions on CCS and preparing for your questions in advance with some of the things we discussed in number 10 at the time. So you've always had your finger on the pulse in terms of scrutinising government policy and have done for a long time. So it's great to have you here.
Well remembered.
No, well, it's something you don't forget. We are. I feel a bit harsh doing this, but we've just in terms of kind of background, we've talked a little bit around the report today. We've given the context. Emma and Tony have given some opening thoughts. So, any opening thoughts from yourself, either on the kind of overall opportunity around hydrogen in the UK, and particularly obviously the opportunity to make the most of our wind generation in Scotland and elsewhere to maximise the green hydrogen production, and then we'll get to questions. And just so you're aware, do start thinking about your questions, including those that are online, because I'll try and bring you in as well after we've heard from Angus.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, you're remembering from 2015, I think Sky News described me before the last liaison committee as a bit of a street fighter when it comes to the liaison committee, so hopefully I wasn't too bad that day. But yeah, thank you and apologies. We've been busy with the 10-minute rule bill affecting Scotland, which of course I have to be there for. But I think this is a really useful report. I'm not sure what you've heard already, but I had a few thoughts before. I've been to see you've probably heard of the Leaving in Fife, the pilot that's going on there with SGN, showing what hydrogen can possibly do going forward in the future. It follows. And the report's a great report. It's not just a report on technical stuff, it's a report with historical context. I didn't realise that the first wind development was in 1887 in Marykirk in Aberdeenshire in Scotland by a James Blythe. So really we maybe haven't accelerated as quickly as we might have from 1887. But there's something else. I mean, you will have heard a lot about the politics there, and you know what was being mentioned there by Antony a second ago about the 14 terawatts. At the moment, that's on page 33 of the report, but it's at about 4 to 5 terawatts at the moment. So I mean, there's a huge increase expected. But I think the area that's been looked at here of the constraint payments being used. I think it was one of the ministers on the post office scandal said on the PM programme on Radio 4 last week that sometimes in the political inbox things get filed in the too difficult to do tray, and then suddenly there's a surge. And obviously, as we all know now, the post office scandal, which has been bubbling for a number of years without much attention, with an ITV drama suddenly bubbled up. And I do think that constraint payments might be one of those things as well that will bubble up at some point, because there's a lot of money going for nothing. And people are going to look and what are they getting for this money. So I think that there's going to be a demand to do something with that. Paying for something for nothing isn't going to wash. So I think the constraint payment issue is going to have to come forward. And you know, if hydrogen is used and hydrogen is produced instead of money for nothing, I think you'll see a happier public, because we're moving in the step of decarbonisation as well. So I do think that is a way that we're going to go. We're going to use that spare energy. I don't underestimate the power of that sort of argument and politics and things suddenly emerging. I think in the report as well it says in 2014, 2015, David Cameron said the public were fed up with wind turbines onshore. That was the English public, because Scotland kept on building wind farms onshore. But the power of that meant that in the intervening years, for about 6 years after that, only 16 turbines were built on the land in England. You may have been there, Josh, of course, when he said that. I'm not sure, but it shows really how things can change, and how things can change quite unexpectedly. That was an unexpected change. The post office was an unexpected change, and I think constraint payments at some point will be a change. The electrolyzers, where they're going to be based, is quite exciting, and jobs that will come with that. So everybody, particularly in areas where there's high production, the Saudi Arabia of wind, as Alex Salmond famously called it at one point, aped by a fellow who succeeded David Cameron, but won as well, Boris Johnson, north of Scotland. I particularly live in the particular Saudi Arabia of wind, where planes and boats don't make journeys sometimes, and trees certainly don't grow. The small island I'm on, you could deforest it in an afternoon. Such is the strength of the wind on an almost daily basis. But this hydrogen area is quite interesting and exciting, and if we want to get more nerdy about it, we can talk about room temperature electrolysis, we can talk about what nuclear power stations can produce at higher temperatures. But I think hydrogen is going to have a bigger part in the mix. And when you see the figures in the report of what hydrogen can replace, this is quite an exciting proposal and something we've got to give a bit of legs to, using these payments, using ways that they're already, the energy is being produced or potentially could be produced. The infrastructure is there to do it at a marginal cost of just about zero. So why aren't we doing it? I think it's the long and the short. And this coming forward makes the case for that. And I think Antony may well have said it, but he's often said it, the beast from the east issue, if everything goes electrical, could we deal with that? Could that energy production be made? The gas people will say it certainly couldn't, and we're going to need hydrogen in the mix going forward. So I'll leave my words there, Josh. No more street fighting from me.
Perfect, excellent. Well, that's the audience can do that. That's not for me. I'm a nice, kind-hearted chap. Thanks very much, Angus. I like your kind of painting that political concern growing around constraint payments, because there's a good connection to the onshore wind argument, as you mentioned. Actually, there was we didn't confront the issues earlier on around things like community benefits and engagement, and then suddenly there was a big sledgehammer introduced, which is clearly not the right decision. So you can see a similar sort of dynamic happening around electrification that clearly needs to continue. So appreciate that view. Let's go to questions. I'm not going to start actually, because I'm very keen to hear from the audience. So please do stick hands up with questions. Just before you do, please do introduce yourself and your organisation, and also make sure you keep your question as a question rather than a statement. And again, online, please do submit questions, because I will go to those at some stage as well. Hands up in the room. The gentleman there to kick us off, if that's all right. Yourself, yes.
Hello, Tobias Burke from Stonehaven. The government, in recent publications and consultations, appears to have taken the position that they view the role that hydrogen will probably play in domestic heating to be fairly minor. This would imply, given that domestic heating is at the moment the majority of demand that the gas network satisfies, this would imply that a large amount of the gas network might be set to decommission should the government pursue with that particular line. Could I just get some thoughts from the panel on how it is that they view the various mechanisms of paying for this particular decommissioning?
Thanks, very good question. Anyone want to kick us off, or I'll just pick on you, Tony?
Thanks very much. So,
Well done, Josh. Thank you.
yeah. I mean, from a statistics point of view, it's a 60-40 split. 40% of our network is for industrial and commercial use, and 60% is domestic. That's across the SGN landscape, at least. So it's not right to say it's all domestic heat by any stretch. The question then is, what applications are going to be used, and what of those users will move across, and when will they move across, and how are you going to actually do that? So any question about decommissioning has to be once you've actually taken everybody off the network. So that there's a big question there. How do you actually do that over an extended period of time, or do you do it on a more focused basis? So it's very difficult to get into a conversation about how would you actually decommission a network until you've actually got a plan that everybody is on an alternative network. So you've got to focus on that first.
And can I just add kind of supplementary, kind of one of the big debates around kind of hydrogen, around things like in the report, large scale production in Scotland, maybe even transfer further south for industrial purposes, is the question around balancing existing infrastructure and the ability to reutilise versus new investment. Any thoughts in terms of kind of how that balance will develop? Because that obviously plays into the decommissioning question as well.
I think if we talk about very large-scale hydrogen production happening in the north and then use further south, the report talks about Project Union, which is what I was focused on in my last job at National Gas, and that promotes then the use of a hydrogen backbone where you can get very, very large volumes of hydrogen moved from A to B. It's a lot more efficient in those larger diameter pipes at higher pressure. So you are able to move it longer distances. It requires some retrofit of the equipment. Once you get to 100% hydrogen, you've got to do a retrofit of compression. So it's not that you can just switch over for one day and move over to another gas the next day. It is a matter of actually moving that infrastructure over for a dedicated use.
Which makes a point on the system. Emma, did you want to come?
Yeah, I mean, we should have all placed bets on how long it took for someone to ask about heat at a hydrogen event. First question. So one of the interesting things about going off and having babies is you often exit the bubble and then re-enter, and you can see how the zeitgeist has changed because you get a little bit of silence, sort of. baby crying and all that. But I came back this time in January and noticed how much the shift in the economics, industry confidence, technology development is now towards electrifying heat. That isn't to say we'll be able to do all heat, but the calculations of what we can do are constantly being revised upwards. The buildings we can put heat pumps into, the technology development, the suppliers that I have that are investing in rolling them out. So Energy UK's position on this is that we will probably electrify most of heat. The exceptions will be where you can make a really interesting economic case around, say, an industrial cluster and a heat network that outweighs the benefits that you will get from an electric form of technology with all the services in the system that you can get with that, things like load shifting and interesting tariffs. So I personally and institutionally don't rule out that there will be some hydrogen for heat. The constraints on that are the amount of it we can produce and how green it is. And that comes back to, I would start with trying to make sure we have enough hydrogen in the economy to start with. And then it's the needs case. So there are other areas of the economy that need it first. So aside from the development on the electricity side, there's also been absolute clarity about where we really, really need it. Things like making fertilisers, where we've got hydrogen feedstocks already. And then the question will be, is there any left to do other things? So I'm spelling out to you a system which is largely electrified with hydrogen for the things that we can't electrify, and or where there's a really good local benefits case. That's what heat looks like. In terms of what that means for the networks, the thing that I said about, we are absolutely clear there will be gas in the system. In all of the CCC modelling and all energy modelling, with a few exceptions which I think are right on the spreadsheet and wrong in real life, you've got things like gas generators on the system, you've got hydrogen storage on the system, we know we need molecules, and what we don't have from government is the joined up vision for what they want to use it for and not. And industry, I would say that this is a personal view, but the quicker you get a signal from government about, a very clear signal about, we don't intend to use the gas network overall for heat, or clarity about where you're going to use gas, we're going to go for electrolyzers, we're going to get a really big volume in these places. The more strategic signalling that can be about what they plan to use hydrogen for, then you get those decisions that fall out about what you're going to do with the gas network and decommissioning and so on. There's a lot of punting the overall, the kind of vision piece, and because of that we're not sure what that means for everything else. And so it's not dodging the question, it's just you've got to start with the first merit order thing, which is, what do you want to use the hydrogen for, government? You know, what is the scale of it? What are you going for? Yeah.
I would echo and support all of what Emma said. And similarly, when I was chair of the Energy and Climate Change Committee and then off to do trade and came back, I noticed the same changes you did over there in the two children. The only thing I would say about I really did, because they were saying before, when we were Energy and Climate Change, that the electrifying the heat was an absolute impossibility. Don't think about it, it came back suddenly when we was talking about it. But the point I would add to your excellent points there, but the government often leaves in the UK things up to market forces and forgets that government is the biggest force in the market. And if government actually uses its muscle in the market, because everybody in the market is looking for a signal from government because it is the biggest force. And government is often in the UK, I find, reticent of doing that, but they're not so in other countries that we look at in the committee.
Yeah, I agree with that completely.
Yep.
Excellent. Let's go back out to questions. I'm going to take two at a time. And a soft signal, not that I'm suggesting what you ask, is let's try and not just focus on hydrogen for heat
as much
as much of that as possible, because I'm sure we've heard the panelist's views. The gentleman in the front row there, and then I think the gentleman behind who had his hand up earlier on. So if we take both, and then we'll go to the panel.
Thank you, Brett of Builders, Merchants and Manufacturers Association. My question is nearly stolen by Emma, and that is, we want hydrogen, we want everyone to succeed with this, but to what purpose are we putting it? I want it for heavy industry, for steel, glass, insulation. Yes, some people want it for heating. I want it for getting ships across to Barra so he can get his home insulation over there. I want it for heavy transport, because my 26 and 40 tonne lorries need that. So my question is, in 10 years' time, when we look back at this, will we have cocked it up? Will we have got it right? Can the government be trusted, as Angus hinted at, because we can do this as businessmen and women? Where is the best chance of success that we get it right first time?
Very good.
Thank you.
Very good.
That's someone who's reached page 43 of the report.
Exactly. Just the gentleman there, if that's all right.
Can you come back?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Jeremy Nicholson from Alpha Energy Group, energy and sustainability consultant and not an energy producer, just in case anyone's interested. Very interested to read the report in due course. My question's on funding. Much though I would like to see technologically neutral market-based funding for storage, which we are going to need regardless of where else hydrogen is consumed in the economy, we're not at the stage, I would suggest, yet where that's going to be practical. So what is the most productive way forward that minimises costs for consumers and ensures best value for money out of whatever money is being made available directly through government or through levies and bills with a view to reducing constraint and other payments?
Very good, very good, excellent. So a question on kind of utilisation, where the best chance of success are in terms of how we allocate, and then a question on kind of the right funding arrangements given the costs involved. Maybe let's go to you first, Emma. And then we can...
That's such a complicated question, Jeremy. What's in the middle of moving house? Sorry. I think if we're talking about realising the vision in this report, we're actually talking about different bits of the value chain all at the same time. So I'd say funding for which bit. So Josh mentioned it, but there's some no-brainer stuff. The CCUS and hydrogen pathways that the government has already announced, a lot of that is about investing in early stage technology development, and traditionally the best way of doing early stage technology development is a little bit of, you kind of pick winners. It's R&D money, it's these projects, it's often public subsidy to try and get things to scale. That's how we've scaled, amongst other things, wind turbines internationally. And the hydrogen industry and those pilots are at that stage. So that seems to me a very good use of that kind of money. And as you said, is it the market or is it government? Deciding that you want the industry here feels to, and investing in those technologies feels like that is a very minimum partnership approach between state and industry, and actually quite a lot of state leadership required there, and if anything we need to go faster. Other countries around the world are, India for example, China, the US, all going faster with bigger pilots, bits of Europe than we have on the industrial side of things and on the technologies. When you think about the wider markets, there is a lively debate about what the right market settlement should be for this overall, and in the long run, when you've got a system with a lot of renewables on it, and you've got other technologies and other services that come to life because of their technologies, clearly you might need a different set of energy market arrangements, the market price signals bit, than you have now. Government is due to publish consultations on REMA, which would affect that bit of value chain. And I think the important thing that you're balancing there in government is the certainty for investors putting their money into the existing system to build grid, to build the renewables, to make the electrons, to do all of that, versus then trying to overcome some of the costs and sticky bits in that hump that I described. Honestly, there is a lively debate, and I have no idea which side of the coin we'll end up with, but I will tell you that again it's been delayed, and I think government needs to start sending very clear signals about what it wants to achieve in the long run, because at least that keeps the investment money moving and allows the market to do its thing while we sort of sort through the complexities of market design. The last thing is, where should it come from? And the bit of this that sits on bills. This is a Energy UK view, but to my mind, one of the problems we have for the ordinary consumer at the moment is we make electricity very expensive because the levies sit on electricity on bills. And if we are thinking about this as an industrial project and investment for the economy, the Energy UK position for a long time has been we should move those levies into taxation, and we should properly think about this. It's less regressive, it gets you a price signal about electricity, it signals that this is sort of state investment on the things that are not electricity. I think it's a sensible thing to do, and I think that's the package of things. There are other things we could do with taxes and incentives to sort of encourage the market signals we're talking about. Have you got, I mean, for those of you that are not energy nerds, the real challenge of this is that it is a value chain. We've got to work out the offtake market, you've got to work out the grid pipelines and which bits of it and where they'll be, and you've got to work out the bit of this which is in the traditionally energy envelope of generators and electricity grid, and where do electrolyzers sit in that world, one or the other. So it's a complex set of market conditions and investment right across the piece, and that's back to the thing we need most of all is a strategic view of that lot.
Great.
Sorry.
Any other thoughts, or should we go back?
Yeah, if I can just pick up the gentleman's question there, sort of where should we focus? I started to answer quite a bit of that in my initial thoughts, and I think it is about the hydrogen industry is so nascent at the moment. We've got to pick some winners. We've got to choose where to get that decarbonisation first. And I think it is about building credibility. It's about building that supply chain. And I think grey hydrogen clearly doesn't have a role at all in net zero. So that's why I highlighted that as a very good place to start. But then some of our heavy industry that we can't electrify, clearly focus on that. There's an element there though, by having focusing your hydrogen into those places, it actually gives time for some innovation further down the line. You know, we've got many years still before we get to net zero. Innovation will come through. There's a lot going on in the electricity industry, there's a lot going on in the hydrogen industry. So things will change. So it's very hard to say, will we look back in 10 years' time and say we've done the wrong thing? You know, none of us have got a crystal ball. But so it is about trying to do the right thing. I'm sure along the way, some things we'll look back in 10 years' time and say we could have done that better. Mm-hmm. But at least if we can try and avoid some of those gotchas, we'll have done the right thing. So I think focus on the very obvious points first, and then I guess where it's at the fringes, we can allow some innovation to occur. And it gives us a bit more time.
Josh, can I just make a small point just on the back of what Emma said? I think the point of putting it under taxation is the correct one to do, but also for the regressive reason, but also for the political defection. Because if it comes to a point in politics where you're looking for a sort of create an issue, it's almost a lot easier to say your energy bills, and I can do something about it by cutting the green crap code. And even the politicians are doing that. No, there is not a long-term thing. The long-term thing to do, it's not a sensible long-term thing to do, but it's short-term, very expedient, especially when it's now January and you're looking at a general election in November. Yeah. You know, there is a temptation, even if it's only to minimise seat losses. You know, and I can understand why a government or a prime minister would do that, but we've built that into the system of why they would sort of defect and rat on the thing. You know. Yeah.
I agree completely. I'm going to actually go online. Matthew Knight from Siemens. Can you hear me, and can you come in for a question?
Be impressive if it works.
Worrying that we're a technology company.
Let's, if you can't hear me, Matthew, let's go to Jasper Clotes. Can you hear me from Karoo Power?
He's probably shouting down.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed, yeah, far away.
Yes, indeed, yeah, sorry, I'm sitting on the other side of a planet in South Africa at the moment. Thank you for the interesting topic that you've got here. I've got actually a statement, but I won't make it. I'm referring from it. I've got a couple of questions, and I'll stick to three forward. For hydrogen, your electrolysis process, you need a constant supply of energy. Your electrolysis process doesn't really need the up and down. And we all know wind is about 15% effective unless the technology has changed, that I don't know. How are you going to manage that? That's the first question. And then I think, Emma, you mentioned that your grid connection, your moving of electrons is quite expensive. So I presume you're going to have the hydrogen plants close to the wind plants, or where the wind sector is built. And then my last question is moving of hydrogen. You must move it in the form of ammonia or CH4, methane gas. Will that be a separate process, or are you going to transport the hydrogen purely as is?
Good, very good. Thanks, Jasper. That's a good set of questions. I'm not going to come to you. I'm actually going to come to you, Tony, just because I think they are kind of interesting questions. So, first, how we deal with the intermittency of the winds. Secondly, in terms of is there a question around location, and then finally, just around kind of the form of transport. Any thoughts on those?
So I think dealing with the intermittency of the wind, that's beyond my technical know-how on the electrolyzers, so I'll defer if there's anybody in the audience that knows the answer to that one. So ask a friend.
In fairness, and even in Fife, you've dealt with that with the storage.
Well, we've got a grid connection at Fife, so that we've got a backup if the wind's not blowing. We've got a grid connection, but then you could end up with.
But you've got storage tanks as well.
Yes, we have there. Yeah. but if you want to run your electrolyser all the time and you've got high carbon electricity on the grid, that's not a good news story coming the other way. So I could see
you had one day,
that.
I think, that you were suspicious of in the next decade when I went to Fife.
Yes, from a production point there. But
I think I can do that question, but you can do the other, you do want to do the other two first, and we can come back to it, or we can carry on this debate now. So there's two things I think sitting under that question. One is the load factor of wind turbines, so how efficient they are when they are generating, and that statistic that was quoted about 50 is now wrong. They are much more efficient, particularly in the new offshore wind models. I think you were going to yell at me. There are people in renewables development in this room. I think the new load factors are over 60 in the UK measured, and we're expecting them to be more with a 50 megawatt turbine. So as efficient in that way on load factor as a gas CCGT-ish. The question about whether they're on all the time, therefore, is a different question. Wind turbines around the UK were on like 80% of the time. The thing that we're talking about is the problem they're on too much rather than too little. The question is, what if you're running your electrolyser and the wind suddenly drops off? Two answers to that. One, the level of information we have about the wind fleet, how it performs, weather, is one of the reasons we've managed to get costs down. For example, we use satellite technology when building wind farms to make sure we get boats out to the fleet at the right time to do maintenance or building, because we can see what the weather patterns are. So you would have National Grid run the entire energy system understanding what weather patterns are likely to be. It's rare that we get caught out with weather or wind speeds changing what we're expecting to do with the assets. So you'll use smart technology and data to run your electrolyser at a time when your fleet is likely to be overperforming, is my guess. My other guess is that you're likely, which is the second part of the question, to have electrolysers where you've got wind turbines, but also where you've probably got an industrial cluster. And my personal view of the kind of hydrogen economy is it's likely to be, at least at first, more localised for the and local in the context of Scotland, rather than shipping or moving it in other ways, for the reasons outlined in the third question that it's hard. So you're quite likely to have multiple assets. And the thing I said earlier about some of these projects being complicated is that is the real challenge we've got at the moment. I've got one developer of a gas generator trying to decarbonise it with hydrogen that is luckily near an industrial cluster where it is the main power source at the moment, as part of the reason they think that they'll still be on and running. That industrial cluster is in turn going to make hydrogen that might be for the power station. No one can decide whose job it is to do the pipeline and the connections, because it's two different bits of the market. So it's quite likely that will be the kind of multi-asset sort of site that we'll see. And that will help solve that problem, because when the wind isn't blowing or you get an emergency, just like you have now with your grid connection, you'll probably have another form of generation asset or a battery or some other thing around, when and if you haven't properly optimised it with all the weather and all the other things.
Yeah, so picking up the latter part of that question, I think the point was we would convert that hydrogen to other substances to move it around. The other substances, converting it back to natural gas or carrying it as ammonia, that adds a huge amount more cost.
Yep.
Whether we're methanating it to get it back to a synthetic natural gas, or whether we're converting it to ammonia, because then potentially you've got to convert it back from ammonia when you use it. You can use ammonia in power station stuff, but I think that adds an additional process. Now, if we could crack the methanation to synthetic natural gas, that's really quite interesting, and do that cost effectively. Technically it can be done. Can it be done cost effectively? Converting to ammonia and then piping ammonia, you're pumping then a fluid. We all know how to pump fluids down pipelines, but ammonia is quite a nasty substance to be moving around. So it doesn't feel right to be going down that route. So the proposal is very much get it into hydrogen and shift the hydrogen around. Use it, or then move it as pure hydrogen, because otherwise the conversion processes are just inefficient.
Yeah, at least in the first instance, as you said. Let's go back to the room. I want to try and do another round of questions. I will take three. I promise to come back to this gentleman, so I will do. And then yourself, and then David. And short questions, ideally, just for time.
Yeah. Thank you very much. My name is Philip Bouvrat, and I work for JCB. So we make construction equipment. The issue we have is we have a hydrogen engine, which is being clamoured for literally into a number of sites. Some of the biggest sites wanting us to project forward how many machines we can put in. The machines are between 3 tons and 20 tons in weight, and the generators are of various different shapes and sizes. We need pure hydrogen. Now, if you look at the two big projects we're working on at the moment, one being East Thames Cross and the other one being Sizewell C, it will be nowhere near a grid for a long time. Even Sizewell, being in the armpit of Sizewell A and B, won't have electricity on site, nor will East Thames. So we have to get the hydrogen delivered to the point of use. And I mean into a bund and then into the machines. Obviously, if it came by pipeline to a certain point, that's fine, but you still have to compress it. Around 750 bar is about the right economic weight, pressure to get the right weight onto trailers. Then that has to be transported to a site, decanted at about 400 bar into a machine at 300, then used at 8 bar in the actual engine. So you've got this cascading down, but we need pure hydrogen. Today, we struggle to buy hydrogen.
I'll just get you towards the question, sorry, just for time.
Sorry, I mean, we struggle to buy hydrogen today, but we've got clients needing pure hydrogen in volumes within 6 months.
It's good to know there's a market there.
Yeah, no,
you know,
that is
that's
definitely the point when it comes about the stretch for lady here.
Thank you. Claudia Toma from Whitestone Insight. Tony, you touched on the fact that we have this opportunity to upskill people into the green economy, especially within hydrogen. But can you talk to me more about what interventions you think are necessary to upskill people well? And whose role will that be? Is that the role of businesses, that role of government? What should we be seeing there? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm David Blackman, representing Utility Week magazine. Just wanted to ask a question about about how we turn the recommendations in this report. Very interesting recommendations about how you solve that chicken egg problem of turning the wasted wind into green hydrogen. I mean, there's talk here about maybe sort of amending contracts for difference, which I presume you'd have to have some kind of regulation or legislation. So just wondering, how do we turn some of the recommendations in this report into practice? How much involves regulation? How much legislation? Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. I should start with you, Angus, that's right. So, question on kind of how we can make sure we're meeting the hydrogen demand that is already there and being developed, especially at manufacturing and industrial sites. A little bit on upskilling than anything on terms of kind of how we bring this to life, which may be more one.
Yeah, as a sort of commented there, I think it's excellent to hear that we're pushing an open door here as regards the demand for this. We aren't just actually thinking of how else to use this money that's going to waste or this power that's going to waste. People are actually crying out for hydrogen, so that's an encouraging thing. On the skills, that's always comes to the fore. And just about every report we've got, it's about getting things done. And again, I think it comes back to the point of government has to step up and government has to realise it is the biggest force in the market. You can't leave this to market forces, because if there's a change, I mean, remember the zero carbon homes, and suddenly George Osborne announced one day he wasn't going to do it. And the point, it was first, and industry had a minor grumble about it in the construction sector. It had a huge grumble afterwards, because they then spent the time in between the first announcement and the second announcement getting prepared to deliver zero carbon homes. But Osborne got into his head it'd be politically popular to kind of do that and to default in a sort of an argument. Again, what politicians will do. So you've got to get them bound into something. So I think government has to step up. Government has to be very firm about what it's doing, and be clear to the market it's going to do that, so there's some security for investment there. And the third point was
turning this, how we need to sort of amend regulations or legislation to turn the recommendations in the report into.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the earlier point I was making, but the constraint payments issue. The constraint payments are going to become a political problem. Something is going to happen around constraint payments. Let's plan this through, rather than have some knee-jerk reaction of suddenly the ministers at the dispatch box. People are making demands. The government's under severe pressure. We know that this is inevitably going to come down the line with the sums that are involved. There's a moment now to sort of plan that so that everybody knows in a very constructive way how we're going to move forward, because there's nothing worse for both those in politics, whether it be government or opposition, trying to find positions on this when we know things are going to shift quickly, and particularly then for industry and investors who are expecting some sort of firm ground to find the sands are shifting very rapidly under them and they don't know which way it's going. So use the time now. I think this report is on that sort of direction really of using the time now.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so if I can pick up on the skills bit, I referred in my remarks to the existing oil and gas resources and people that are out there. And actually that step change to hydrogen is a step change. It's not a case of massive retraining, it is an incremental step for a lot of people that sit within that sector. They've still got to prove they're competent, but actually it is a step change, it's an education piece. But I think we also have to recognise there's an awful lot of people in that industry that are, should we say, at the more mature end of the scale. And actually, I hope by 2050 and net zero, I'll be retired. So it's the next generation we've got to attract into this market. It's your children's age.
Actually,
isn't
disappointingly, I'll still be working in 2050.
But it's how do we actually then engage through the school system to actually educate about net zero, educate about green tech and the needs of the industry as a whole, and make that exciting, make that a place that our children actually want to work in. Yeah. So I think it has to start in schools. We've got to make sure that the right mechanisms are in place then through apprenticeships, through various degree courses and whatever we need to make sure that we've got the grads coming through that will actually deliver net zero in 2050. So I think we've got to have this long-term view, and there's a lot of resource going to be needed. I mentioned about the huge amounts of infrastructure we're going to have to build. There are entire careers out there for people. It's actually a really exciting place for people to work, and I just don't think we've captured that imagination yet and really excited people.
Very good, very good. And I'm going to draw us to a close in a moment, and thanks for the great questions. Sorry for those I didn't come to. I'm just going to ask a very quick fire last one, because that's my prerogative, and then I will close the event. So we're obviously going to see...
Because I want to, yeah.
It's election year. We may or may not have a new Prime Minister come October, November, depending on who you believe. But obviously, the one question will be kind of a new Prime Minister coming in, a new government coming in. What's number one on their in tray? So if you were writing the briefing for the new Prime Minister come November, and we were talking about these issues, how to accelerate the development of both the energy transition and the UK's hydrogen economy, what is the kind of one thing that you would put top of your list that the new Prime Minister should crack on with? Maybe I'll start with you, Emma, and then I'll go to Angus and then Tony.
I think it's a very personal view. No one on the Energy UK Public Affairs team is in the room. Hooray! I think there are two really big issues for me that I think about all the time in this job, and they are broadly attracting inward investment into the UK economy. So making clear decisions early, sticking to them, not flip-flopping on them. We've talked about that, and then having the markets underneath that will drive the investment. Your question about skills, the private sector will do loads of this. We have seen that with the US IRA. I know that from my own sector, we've got 100 billion pipeline of investment opportunity just in the membership of Energy UK. There is lots of money out there. The challenge is deploying it into viable projects. So investment, and then I suppose in that envelope, grid and planning, dear God, it's no longer the do we want to do it, it's can we actually get spades in the ground, can we get the stuff, why does this not work? So I would be doing a big regulatory bit. The other thing that I think about all the time is we are still in an energy crisis for millions and millions of homes, and I think there are two things there. One, targeted support for people who cannot afford their energy right now, let alone through the transition, and then related to that, fairness, and that underlines the talking point on levies really. It's about we've got to make sure that this feels good for people now, not just in 10 years' time. And I would be thinking very carefully about what the retail offer on all of this is, not the energy retail, but the political retail offer is, making the benefits as clear to ordinary people.
Yeah, I mean, I think, firstly, I heard Emma say that she'd be working still in 2050, and poor MPs are not sure what they're doing after October, November. So I mean, it gives you a jolt to think as to the time frame of what governments are thinking of. I mean, I think Jeremy Hunter said as much off the record, which is basically what I've said. I think if you're a new government coming in, and I think it will be a new government unless something really changes, and a week is a long time in politics, events to your boy, and all the caveats. But if you're a new government coming in, you will have some sort of gush at the beginning, and you'll have a bounce that'll last you a wee while, but you've got to look forward. What are going to be your landmines? I think I come back to the point, I do think that a big landmine you're going to see are constraint payments at some point. I really don't think the UK economy with Brexit and all the rest of it is going to be seeing the big step change with a change of government at all. I think the problems that the Resolution Foundation pointed out at the beginning of December, that over the last 15 years, average wages in the UK are 10,700 behind the similar-ish countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. That's what's leading to the 1 in 4 that are living in fuel poverty at the moment. And I think a social tariff is something else that government's got to look at. It's a question I've just raised in the ESNES questions. They were actually delayed to 11:45 because I had a technical problem in the House, but maybe Brexit and lack of technicians again. But I think you've got to look at the landmine issue, and I think the landmine issue is probably going to be constrained payments coming forward. And I think if you're a new government coming in, do something about that. Prevent yourself being embarrassed by handing out, and it'll be sort of in the papers or whatever. Labour, as it likely be, Labour hands billions to fat cats. It's not a headline that they're going to want to see. So get something done about that. And this is a good way of doing something about that. Now, there are other questions you can ask, given the constraint payments at $1 billion, or whatever they're going to be, maybe $2 billion in a couple of years. Are you producing this hydrogen very expensively? You know, is that $1 billion now becoming this hydrogen, and what's the cost of hydrogen per energy unit? That's another issue. But it's not an issue of giving money for nothing, which I think is really going to stick in the craw. And I do think that stat I just gave of 10,700, that gap that's grown in the last 15 years, is going to go wider for the UK, unfortunately. So that is something I would say that they should move. Obviously, if I think from something that people are going to be affected by, and our committee's called for this, preparing for winter, paragraph 24, I'm sure you've all read the report, some one not there. You know, the social tariff is called for by all members of the committee, regardless of the political party. So I do think that's something the government should get on with, because energy and a difficulty of getting to energy is going to become a bigger and more acute social issue.
I think Emma hit the nail on the head. I think it's around long-term plans that investors can actually work against. You know, they need a de-risked environment in which to operate. So net zero is a marathon, although we are in a global race. There's an interesting dynamic going on here. Money can go anywhere in the world. We've got to make sure that the right signals are here in the UK for the investment to come in. And the money will come, the investors will come. And that then gives us a trajectory that we can all work to and plan towards. Any chopping and changing of that, it's risky. So we need to avoid all of that.
Very good, thank you all. And I think that brings us more or less to a close. I think there's kind of just 3 things that resonated for me, which I think you actually picked up very well at the end, Tony. Kind of, it's clear that there is a growing issue around constraint payments and the overall cost of energy, and we talked about that in both a kind of macro sense as well as a narrow sense. Kind of dealing with that, government signals, certainty, clarity, and also not underestimating the power that government has to shape that market by giving clear signals early on. And then finally, just kind of getting on with some of the detail and thinking quite carefully about the recommendations in this report that actually enable some action, as well as obviously in other areas. That will be one of the first jobs, obviously, for a new government. So that obviously came through very strongly. Again, huge thank you for everyone joining. Really great questions. And if we could just thank the panel in the normal way to close, that'd be lovely. Thanks very much for coming.